So I would like to invite the key speakers up here on the podium for the third session, and our honorable moderator, Miss Marie-Pierre Poirier. So we need just a couple of minutes to change the tags. Nice to see you. Nice to see you. Let me introduce our moderator, Marie-Pierre Poirier. Is the UNICEF Regional Director for Central and Eastern Europe and the Commonwealth of Independent States since February 2012. Prior to this, Ms. Poirier assumed the representation of UNICEF in Brazil in 2004, bringing to the position over 20 years' experience in Asia, Africa, Europe, and Latin America in the development and management of rights-based country programs of cooperation crafted and implemented with the government, civil society, and the private sector. And her career actually started in the UN, began in October 1984 at UNICEF headquarters in New York, working in the program division dealing with poverty and exclusion in urban areas. So we are having such a dedicated UN officer here and so much experienced ones. So the floor is yours. And the ruling is yours for this session.
Oh, thank you. Well, thank you very much, Mr. Vice Chairperson, and my warm thanks to the organizers also for the opportunity to moderate this session on inequalities, social inclusion and rights, issues which have been highlighted by many as key to the post-2015 agenda. Dear participants, I'm pleased to welcome you to one more opportunity for a fruitful exchange of experiences and perspectives, and I trust that this dialogue will open new avenues to accelerate partnerships and accelerate progress towards the elimination of the human rights of women and disadvantaged groups. As my fellow moderators have done, let me just take a few minutes to remind you of the sequence that we have planned for our session. We will start now with our keynote presentation, then break for lunch, reconvene in the afternoon at 2:30, start with our two discussants, and after these presentations, the floor will be opened for participants who express their will to speak by subscribing to interventions prior to the conference. If time remains, we'll try to be as disciplined as the other sessions. If time remains, the floor will be open for additional questions and comments, and all participants, of course, will make interventions of 5 minutes or less. At the end of our session, our rapporteur, as usual, will summarize the debate. So without further ado, it is my great pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, Madame Danielle Bousquet. Madame Bousquet is the President of the High Council for Equality between Women and Men in France. She is a former member of Parliament, former Vice Chairperson of the delegation of the National Assembly on Women's Rights and Equal Opportunities between Men and Women, and Vice President of the European Parliamentary Forum on Population and Development. Madame Bousquet has also been Vice President and Secretary of the French National Assembly between 2009 and 2010, a member of the Judiciary Committee, President of the Policy Evaluation Mission to Prevent and Combat Violence Against Women, and Chair of the Special Committee on the Bill Strengthening the Protection of Victims and the Prevention and Punishment of Violence Against Women. So it's a great pleasure that I give you the floor.
Merci beaucoup. À l'inverse de mes collègues et prédécesseurs, je vais parler en français, donc je vous laisse le temps de régler vos écouteurs. Voilà, c'est avec beaucoup de plaisir donc, que je me trouve parmi vous aujourd'hui. Le contexte européen et international dans lequel s'inscrit cette conférence et les grandes échéances internationales qui vont venir nous appellent à répondre à l'exigence majeure d'aujourd'hui qui est celle des inégalités de genre qui, aujourd'hui, aux quatre coins du monde, existent partout et persistent de manière structurelle et transversale. C'est pourquoi partout dans le monde, et notamment dans le continent qui est le mien, l'Europe, la lutte contre les inégalités doit être une priorité, et je dirais même la priorité, car cette lutte inlassable répond à notre objectif universel d'émancipation de toutes et de tous, et c'est le moteur du développement économique et humain. En effet, toutes les études, et cela a été dit à maintes reprises hier et aujourd'hui, toutes les études montrent que les sociétés les plus inégalitaires obtiennent de moins bons résultats dans toute une série d'indicateurs qui vont de la santé et l'espérance de vie à l'incidence des grossesses sur les jeunes filles et les adolescentes ou encore sur la mobilité sociale. Et qui plus est, les inégalités ont des conséquences négatives non seulement sur les personnes concernées, mais également sur l'ensemble des sociétés. Donc les femmes, les jeunes, les personnes âgées, les migrants, les minorités diverses, les personnes handicapées, tous ces groupes défavorisés se trouvent en situation de plus grande vulnérabilité, sont discriminés et parfois ont un accès largement limité aux droits et aux services. C'est la raison pour laquelle nous avons un besoin urgent d'investissement proactif dans les développements social et humain afin de permettre l'émancipation de tous les individus et que chacune et chacun soit en mesure d'exercer le droit à disposer de son corps et d'être acteur ou actrice de sa vie ou de ses choix. Du fait des menaces qui pèsent aujourd'hui sur les systèmes de protection sociale, en Europe en particulier, seules les sociétés les plus inclusives, justes, équitables, permettront de faire face aux défis économiques, sociaux, environnementaux ou encore démographiques que l'on connaît dans certains pays d'Europe. Les dirigeants seraient dans l'erreur s'ils voulaient hiérarchiser les enjeux, à trop regarder seulement les chiffres de la croissance économique et mésestimer le développement humain. Nous pourrions n'avoir ni l'un ni l'autre. C'est donc bien d'une approche globale dont l'Europe a besoin. Et dans cette perspective, l'égalité entre les femmes et les hommes doit être intégrée partout, dans toutes les politiques, dans tous les domaines, de manière transversale, et faire dans le même temps l'objet d'actions spécifiques pour rattraper le retard et permettre le plein développement de nos sociétés. Je vais illustrer à partir de l'exemple de la France la manière dont on peut mettre en place des conditions qui permettent à chacun d'exercer ses choix individuels. Pour ce qui est de la France aujourd'hui, la volonté est de véritablement transformer les politiques publiques en posant l'égalité entre les femmes et les hommes comme une priorité politique. L'importance de l'égalité des sexes est soulignée par sa prise en compte dans le programme de la CIPD, dans le programme de Pékin et dans les objectifs du millénaire, à tel point que la réalisation de cet objectif conditionne la réalisation de tous les autres objectifs. Et pourtant, les discriminations envers les filles et les femmes, la violence sexiste, les discriminations économiques, les discriminations professionnelles, les atteintes à leur santé sexuelle et reproductive restent la forme la plus répandue et la plus persistante des inégalités, et cela dans tous les pays quels qu'ils soient, y compris dans nos pays européens. Partant de ces constats, en France, on assiste à une nouvelle donne. Le gouvernement s'est engagé à refaire de la question des femmes une politique publique à part entière et non une simple question périphérique. Si les droits des femmes redeviennent un enjeu central et un enjeu transversal de toutes les politiques publiques, cela nécessite un changement de méthode et un changement de rythme que l'on observe dorénavant dans plusieurs champs. Tout d'abord, et cela va peut-être vous surprendre, un investissement personnel de tous les ministres qui ont été sensibilisés aux questions de genre et à l'égalité entre les femmes et les hommes. Ensuite, la mise en place de hauts fonctionnaires à l'égalité dans chacun des ministères. Ensuite encore, la désignation d'un référent égalité femmes-hommes dans les cabinets ministériels, tous les cabinets ministériels. Ensuite, la réunion d'un comité interministériel, donc de tous les ministres, pour les droits des femmes, qui a établi une feuille de route à suivre pour chacun des ministères. Et enfin, la mise en place de nouvelles études d'impact genrées qui vont regarder tous les textes législatifs et réglementaires pour voir quelle incidence ces nouveaux dispositifs vont avoir, de manière différenciée ou non, sur les femmes et sur les hommes. Vous voyez bien qu'il s'agit là de changer le mode de fonctionnement de l'État afin que chaque politique publique intègre l'exigence d'égalité de fait entre les femmes et les hommes. Mais au-delà de l'égalité de fait, il y a bien évidemment l'égalité de droit qui, pour lutter contre la pauvreté et les violences envers les femmes, sont absolument indispensables. Alors dorénavant, cela a été dit également pour d'autres pays européens ce matin, l'éducation sexuelle est intégrée et enseignée à l'école, intégrée dans la formation des enseignants. La contraception est libre, gratuite et effective pour les jeunes. Et les femmes et les jeunes peuvent décider librement d'avorter. Et cet avortement est dorénavant remboursé à 100%. Parce qu'on sait que lorsque l'accès à l'IVG pose problème, ce sont toujours les plus pauvres qui ont le plus de difficultés. C'est une question de justice sociale. Nous avons donc voulu mettre en place un environnement qui permette l'exercice des choix individuels des personnes quant à la manière de mener leur vie et en particulier leurs droits sexuels et reproductifs. Ces engagements sont fondamentaux en matière de justice sociale et de respect des droits des personnes. Et pour rejoindre le débat qu'il y avait hier sur qu'est-ce que ça a comme influence sur l'indice de fertilité, eh bien, cela a une incidence positive sur la fertilité, puisque, ou je dirais plutôt sur la fécondité, puisque la France a le 3e meilleur taux de fécondité des femmes en Europe. De la même manière qu'est étudiée l'extension du congé parental d'éducation au père, de manière à permettre effectivement une meilleure articulation des temps de vie entre vie professionnelle et vie personnelle et familiale, dont on sait que c'est un point de difficulté aujourd'hui dans nos pays où les femmes travaillent à 80%, quand il n'y a pas de mode d'accueil de la petite enfance qui soit suffisamment développé. Et donc, tout à l'heure, le représentant de la France indiquait 275 000 nouvelles places de crèche dans les 5 ans à venir et une école maternelle largement possible à partir de l'âge de 2 ans dorénavant en France. Et toujours dans la même perspective de respecter les droits des personnes et leur choix de vie, la France a autorisé récemment donc le mariage entre les personnes de même sexe et l'adoption par ces couples mariés. Une nouvelle structure de gouvernance voit également le jour en France l'a également été d'hier, l'importance d'avoir de nouvelles structures de gouvernance qui associent la société civile. Eh bien, c'est le cas pour le Haut Conseil à l'égalité entre les femmes et les hommes, qui a été créé au mois de janvier 2013 par le président de la République et dont j'assure la présidence. C'est une instance consultative et c'est un outil, et je dirais un atout, de la nouvelle donne française au regard des 4 missions principales qui sont celles de ce Haut Conseil à l'égalité entre les femmes et les hommes. Il s'agit d'abord d'animer le débat public dans la société française et de le faire vivre dans la société française, sur toutes les questions que j'indiquais précédemment. Il s'agit ensuite d'assurer, et c'est extrêmement important, je dirais que pour moi c'est la mission majeure, d'assurer la concertation avec la société civile en associant de nombreuses associations et ONG donc, à nos travaux et à nos décisions. Nous avons aussi pour rôle d'évaluer les politiques publiques, aussi bien les politiques publiques qui sont spécifiques envers les femmes que celles qui s'intéressent à l'impact différencié sur les femmes et sur les hommes des textes de loi, règlements et différentes politiques menées nationalement ou régionalement. Et notre 4e mission, et elle n'est pas négligeable, c'est de formuler des avis pour le gouvernement et des propositions. Je dirais que notre mission principale, si je voulais la résumer, c'est celle de faire vivre l'exigence d'égalité dans tous les domaines. C'est notre mission première, y compris dans nos politiques d'aide au développement. Et à cet égard, la France a décidé d'aller plus loin en matière de relations internationales. Aujourd'hui, dans différentes enceintes multilatérales, on voit que les engagements du Caire et les engagements de Pékin peuvent être régulièrement remis en cause, mais la France refuse que les relativismes culturels et les intégrismes religieux puissent remettre en cause le caractère universel des droits humains que sont les droits des femmes et les droits sexuels et reproductifs des femmes. En effet, comment lutter efficacement contre toute forme de violence si les femmes et les filles ne peuvent pas exercer librement leur droit d'accéder à des services de planification familiale et à des services d'avortement sécurisés? Car il n'y a pas d'égalité des droits sans véritable autonomie des femmes dans tous les domaines. Et cette autonomie n'a de réalité que si elle englobe le droit à disposer de son corps et à décider librement d'un avortement. C'est pourquoi, à l'occasion des grandes réunions du programme de développement post-2014, il est indispensable que les gouvernements adoptent une approche plus pragmatique et non idéologique sur la question de l'avortement. Et en premier lieu, sa dépénalisation, sa légalisation, pour aller jusqu'au bout des engagements de la CPID. Partout dans le monde, y compris en Europe aujourd'hui, les besoins et les droits humains des jeunes filles et des femmes doivent être traités de toute urgence. C'est une question de cohésion et de justice sociale. Et c'est aussi une des conditions du développement durable. Il n'est plus besoin, en effet, je crois que ça a été démontré très largement hier et ce matin, il n'est plus besoin de faire la preuve qu'investir dans la santé et l'éducation des filles et des femmes en particulier permet de briser durablement le cercle vicieux de la pauvreté. C'est la raison pour laquelle ces sujets doivent aujourd'hui quitter le domaine technique. Cela a déjà été affirmé hier matin avec force. Doivent quitter le domaine technique car ils exigent un nouveau dialogue politique sur la scène internationale. Je vous remercie.
Well, merci beaucoup, Madame Bousquet. I'll continue in English just because I've been. for a very inspiring presentation. Lots of very important points you made. I just noted a few. Maybe the global relevance, even in Europe, of the unfinished agenda of eliminating barriers for all citizens to realize their rights, regardless of gender, age, ability, or origin. The point you ended with about the importance of political commitment and political dialogue to move forward on our common agenda, and the need to institutionalize the centrality of efforts to move towards gender equality in all parts of the governmental machinery in dialogue with civil society. And then at the end, the importance to invest in women and girls and adolescent girls to break the intergenerational transmission of poverty. I'm sure the rapporteur will have many more points, but those were really key. I will give the floor to the secretary before inviting you all for the sandwich break, which will last only 20 minutes outside of this conference room. Would you like to talk about this, Madam Secretary?
Good morning. I didn't say it today yet, so, or a good noon. I have two announcements. As Chair promised, we will have a Chair summary draft for the first part of the conference for the yesterday and the second session today. It will be distributed on your tables in about 10 minutes. So 10-15 minutes allow for making 300 copies we need to make. So, and the sandwich break will be just right around the corner here on the right side when you go out of the room. So with your sandwich, you see when the secretaries come with the piles of the documents to distribute, you can then come back into the room and pick up the chair's summary.
Did you read this?
I try. I've got something to read aloud now, sorry.
It's regard to the chair.
It is from the chair a note. Excellency, Mr. Vice Chair.
This is now here.
Okay. In order to give participants more time to read the draft chair summary, the chair has agreed to have the full draft distributed as it is at this point to you now. Obviously, this draft is not a finalized draft in regards to the part of the sessions that have not yet taken place, but reflects in regards to the inequalities, social inclusion and rights, what was brought in from the thematic meeting and from statements that refer to these issues. This part will be completed at the end of the respective session, but the chair wants you to have as much of the summary as possible already. So there will be some insights already for the session that we heard, just an opening speech. So these two messages that I had to announce. Thank you.
Sorry, I thought it was going to take 10 more minutes.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. So we have 20 minutes for sandwich. We'll reconvene in this same room for the panel discussion, and our thematic session starts at 2:30. Thank you very much.
Very much for understanding. We begin.
Dear participants, we are resuming our third session. And our first discussant for this afternoon
I wonder what happened to them.
Colleagues, thank you, Chairperson, for allowing us to start our afternoon session of this third panel. Well done. We are now resuming with our first discussant, Madame Milena Kadieva. Ms. Kadieva is the Managing Director of the Gender Alternatives Foundation in Bulgaria, a member of ASTRA, the Central and Eastern Europe Women's Network for Sexual and Reproductive Health and Rights. She is a human rights lawyer and an activist in several Bulgarian NGOs. Her main interest rests in international human rights law, particularly women's human rights protection, and the European system of human rights protection. Her work has focused on violence against women, discrimination, sexual and reproductive rights and health, as well as socioeconomic rights of women. Ms. Kadieva will present the results of the thematic expert meeting on inequalities, social inclusion and rights, which was convened as part of the ICPD Beyond 2014 process in the UNECE region. Kadieva, you now have the floor.
Thank you very much, and I hope you can hear me. You see me standing here for two reasons. The first reason is related to our lunch panel. Actually, as all of you heard and seen, it was a very interactive, very dynamic one. And I don't want to sit behind the panel and to have your attention with percentages, data, and numbers, but to try to continue one way or another with this almost interactive session that started at lunchtime, and to have my presentation in the similar manner. The second reason is part of my profession and my work. As I was already presented, and thank you for that, I'm a human rights lawyer. I'm not a politician, I'm not a statistician, and I'm not an academician. So my work is basically related to talking, a lot of talking, being present before the judges in the courtrooms, and speaking in front of audience, and trying to catch their attention for a while, to present my arguments, and in order to do so in a proper and adequate manner, I always need examples. So what I'm going to try to present to you today is a brief, concise resume of the outcomes of one of the meetings that we had in Belgrade in April this year. It was focused on equality, social rights, and inclusion. My presentation, of course, is on PowerPoint, as you can see, but I'm not going to bother you with all of the details, what are part of it. And I'll try to give you the session as it is seen by the eyes and the lenses of the participants that we had in Belgrade, in the Republic of Serbia. So firstly, actually, one of the things which was more important for me, speaking about the panelists and the participants in that session, was the simple fact that for a kind of maybe first time in my working and professional life, there was basically a very fair presentation of people in that meeting. Participants from governments, ministries, UN agencies, civil society organizations, and young people. And when I say young people, I look to the auditorium here as well, and would like to say big thank you to the young people that were so innovative and dynamic and active and outspoken. Every time I'm traveling somewhere, I'm looking at the auditorium, especially in such important events which are taking place at the European or international level. Because the number of young people, the way they are represented, and the opportunity that they have to be part of the process give us the hope for the future for the world. So in Belgrade, we had it, and that was really great. There were several young persons from different countries, including some from Uzbekistan, which was a bit surprising for me, I have to say. And we had, in addition to that, LGBT young persons and representatives of Roma minorities young persons. So as you can see, a huge and interesting session we had because the participants were very interesting as such. What we discussed, basically, it was divided in 4 sessions. It was precisely the same way as the previous 2 thematic meetings took place. So I'm not going to bother you with the details how exactly the program was scheduled, but just with the main conclusions and the main results that we achieved. Speaking about the first session on equality, what is actually one of the most important things which was discussed in the session is that basically it is not so much the differences between the countries that matters nowadays, but the differences within the countries. And the examples that we got for this meeting came most of all in countries from the former Soviet republics, the former Soviet bloc, and some of the stories we listened to were related to the fact that On the one hand, you have a population living in the big cities, in the capitals, that are basically provided to at least essential information and services and have access to education and justice. And then on the other hand, you have a huge percentage of the population living in remote places and small villages and having nothing of this. So what is the most important for us as participants was the fact that we have to look in our own countries more closely in order to try to be helpful to the people in those areas. The second session about the successes and the challenges, you can see the huge list of the topics and the issues that we discussed. I'm not going to read them out loud anyway. What was important for me to see in this session was the fact that, I don't know why it is happening, maybe it is human nature. What we started to do in the very beginning is speaking about the difficulties, the problems, the challenges, and not speaking so much about the positive things that happened. But during the discussion, which was great, of course, there were lots of interruptions from the different parts of the participants. And of course, they gave some examples which were positive. And that's why you have the list of the successes in the region, which are related to reduced maternal mortality, increased access to contraception, increased access to young people to information and services. Of course, this is not happening everywhere. It is not happening in the scale it should be. And we, of course, seen that in the previous day and a half with this meeting as well. About the challenges, and I'm going to give you two small examples here. You can see the list, but we have been hearing about one of the challenges all of the time here as well. And this is the lack of comprehensive sexuality education to young people. One of the participants in the Belgrade meeting was coming from Lithuania, so we got the Lithuanian story. And it was very much in detail presented to us since the 1990s. After Lithuania started this so-called democratic process of development, lots of achievements have been done in the country, lots of new laws and policies and practices. But what happened after 2004, when Lithuania finally became member of the European Union, was the fact that there were kind of a reunification of the Catholic Church and some representatives of the conservative parties, and some very interesting negative experience and attempts, especially in that area of education, access to information of youth, and access to education, especially in the areas of sexual and reproductive health and rights. And the lady from Lithuania presented to us, of course, the very recent attempts in the parliament to ban abortion. And they still have this problem. And we're speaking about an EU country, one of the developed ones. So we still have these challenges. The other example, when we speak about violence against women, as it was presented today again from the representative of the Spanish government, whom I really thank you, violence against women is one of the factors that mostly is related to inequality, and especially to gender inequality. What was discussed in the meeting was the high level of violence against women in Europe. I think it's not secret to anyone in the audience that, according to the last statistical data, every fifth woman in the European Union is a victim of gender-based violence, at least one time in her lifespan. What we were discussing in this regard is the legal basis and the actions that we could undertake in both of these areas, speaking about sexual and reproductive health and rights, and speaking about violence against women. So it was my, let's say, obligation to say, as a lawyer, during this meeting that in addition to the agenda that we have during the ICPD and the Plan of Action, we have a huge list of international and regional conventions and other norms which are obligatory for our countries, and they have to abide by them. The practice that we have to follow is the core practice, which is there, the international human rights law, the international human rights courts, and the regional organs, and the United Nations human rights treaty bodies. So I would like to remind to all of you, especially those being representatives of the civil society organizations and the lawyers among them, when we speak about sexual and reproductive health and rights, please look into the practice of the European Court of Human Rights. The standards are there if your governments are not taking their responsibility seriously. The leading example, it is a case against Poland, Tichon versus Poland. When we speak about violence against women, again, I'm going to present you the example of the European Court of Human Rights. The leading case there should be Opus versus Turkey. And there are lots of other cases in this regard as well. And they are adopted not only by the court in Strasbourg, but also by the Court of the European Union, and also by the Committee on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. Speaking about SHRSR, the communications are number 4 against Hungary, AS versus Hungary, and number 17, which is against Brazil. It is Brazil. Of course, it is not part of the UNECE region, but the standards are the same, and the principles are there. And when we speak about violence and the CEDAW committee practice, there is a huge case law nowadays. Please use it. There are communications like number 2, number 5, number 6, number 20, 23, 31, 32. 3 of them are against Bulgaria. The examples of communications number 20, 31, and 32. And I can give you the example of our successes and challenges. Of course, the government didn't like our actions, as you can imagine. But as a result of these 3 decisions of the CEDAW committee, we are part of the Inter-Ministerial Working Group for changing the Bulgarian legislation in the area of protecting women against domestic violence and gender-based violence. Session 3, speaking about gender equality and the empowerment of women. Of course, I'm not going to surprise any one of you with saying that when we speak about family policies and gender equality, it is mostly women who are performing both work in the homes and outside the homes, and there is no real clear responsibility sharing between the partners and the husbands in that area. And when we speak about policy responses, of course, something positive should be said. Probably the Swedish example should be given here, because they have interesting policy at national level about reconciling professional and public life and with private life. I'm not going to speak more about gender-based violence. I think I was speaking enough about this topic. Just a few sentences about the restrictive pro-natalist policies. I think it is an issue that is re-emerging in our region, unfortunately. And some examples were given by other colleagues from the EU delegation and from representatives of ASTRA as well. There is interesting, in brackets, legislation coming in countries like Lithuania and Macedonia. And these are either countries part of the European Union or countries which are on the way to become such. So all of us should be careful what's going on at legislative level as well. The last session with the inequalities and the vulnerable groups. We had a huge discussion: who is vulnerable, why they are vulnerable, is there multiple vulnerabilities, and which groups should be put on the priority list and which is not so important nowadays. The list is huge. It is not listed exhaustively here, and that's why I'm going to just mention a few words about young people again, because some positive examples should be given as well. One that I would like to share with you is a Bulgarian example. In our organization, for instance, we have a youth department. And as far as I'm concerned, there should be youth department in every possible institution and organization at national, local, and international level. It is the only way to really have the youth participation and their meaningless voice in the work that we are performing. Yes, I'm just reminded about the time, but this is the last slide anyway. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much for your presentation and for your understanding. We want to do as well as previous sessions in terms of time management. Let me now turn to our second discussant, Professor Kate Pickett. Professor Pickett is a professor of epidemiology at the Department of Health Sciences of the University of York in the United Kingdom. Previously, she was a career scientist of the National Institute for Health Research. She's the co-author with Professor Richard Wilkinson of The Spirit Level, chosen as one of the top 10 books of the decade by the New Statesman, and was also the winner of the Publication of the Year by the Political Studies Association, which was translated in 23 languages. Finally, she's the co-founder and director of the Equality Trust. Professor Pickett, floor is yours, 15 minutes, please.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Moderator, colleagues on the panel, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. Good afternoon. I am sorry to be speaking to you during what should be our siesta, but I will try to keep us awake. I'm very happy to be here, and I was very excited to read in the ICPD Beyond 2014 review, the report of the 3 expert meetings, how much attention was being paid to inequalities, social inclusion, and rights. And at the beginning of that section of the report, it sets out our improved understanding of the impact of inequalities, based largely on the lifelong work of my colleague and co-author Richard Wilkinson. And that new understanding was echoed this morning in the opening remarks we heard from Madame Bousquet. I'm not going to show you too much data. If you can understand this slide, you get the point. Social inequality, often measured as income inequality, is strongly correlated with worse average levels of many health and social problems. On this chart, you can see rich developed countries scoring worse on an index of health and social problems that includes both physical and mental health, measures of human capital development, measures of social cohesion. But what's also true, and what isn't shown in this chart, is that inequality seems to affect everybody, not just the poor and those at the bottom of society. It's a social pollutant. Its impact is harshest at the bottom of society, but none of us are immune. And it's not just adults that are affected. This chart shows the 2007 UNICEF Index of Child Wellbeing, with the more equal countries on the left having a much higher level of child well-being than the more unequal countries over on the right. And that UNICEF index contains almost 40 measures of child well-being, everything from whether children are immunized and infant mortality rates, to whether or not teenagers engage in sexual activity at too early an age, binge drinking, whether they can get on with their peers, whether they can talk to their parents. But this is perhaps the most important of the charts I'm going to show you. It shows that social mobility is lower in more unequal countries. You can't have equality of opportunity without equality of outcome. And this analysis has been reproduced using independent data by Alan Kruger, who's Assistant Secretary of Economic Policy in Obama's administration and is now Chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors to the President. In the UK, we see gaps open up by age 3 years in children's cognitive development, in their health and well-being. And that's as a result of the pressures that inequality and hierarchy put on parents. In more unequal countries, people work longer, they're more in debt, they're more prone to depression, they are living in societies with lower levels of provision for childcare, maternal or paternal leave, and all of those things add up to mean that children in more unequal societies are born with fewer opportunities. This isn't something that we can overcome necessarily with early childhood education provision or schooling. It's the way in which inequality is passed on generation to generation. I'm going to skip that one. But as well as understanding the impact of inequality on health and well-being, academics and experts across a whole range of disciplines and areas of interest are starting to understand the damage that inequality does. So economists are showing us how bad inequality is for economic stability. They're showing us how impossible it is to address and deal with extreme poverty unless we deal with inequality first. Psychologists and sociologists and anthropologists are showing us the psychosocial damage that inequality does, the stress it causes us, the way it leads to more hostility, more self-enhancement, more depression, more aggression. And finally, we're now starting to learn from environmental scientists and ecological economists the damage that inequality does to the environment. More unequal societies have less biodiversity, mostly due to their land tenure. More equal societies recycle more unequal societies consume more. Inequality and the environment are deeply interlinked. So what we have here is a profound lever for social and indeed environmental change, a way in which we actually can improve the quality of life, and by quality of life, I do mean everything: health, education, well-being for all, whether it's women, children, the elderly, ethnic minorities, those in religious minorities, the disabled. Anything that puts you in a position where you're more likely to be socially excluded or marginalized, or more likely to be at the bottom of the social scale, all of those are going to be worse for you if you live in a more unequal society. And understanding this, I think, can lead us out of the impasse between the urge for continued rampant economic growth and our actual real need for retraction in the face of climate change and environmental constraints. We have an alternative vision here and an alternative possibility. But what also struck me reading the report was that by the time I came to the end and came across the solutions that were being proposed, I was no longer actually quite as excited. I saw that the solutions being proposed were more to do with promoting human rights through changes in attitudes, calls for more research, and calls for more education, none of which seem to grapple with this root source of so many of our problems. If we need greater economic and social equality, then we need to address that head on, rather than try and fix the problems that it causes. Otherwise, we're in the position that we all might be in if we leave the tap running in the bathroom upstairs, and we run up and mop up a bit, but we don't turn off the tap. Bruce Campbell spoke about partnerships as a silver bullet, but we need to think carefully about the target. What are we really trying to change? I've been hugely privileged recently to join an international expert working group commissioned by the Royal Government of Bhutan to create a new development paradigm to deliver to the United Nations next year in 2014, clearly with the aim of feeding into the post-2015 development goals and the new UN Sustainable Development Goals. We've developed a framework as part of that work which places well-being and happiness as a central goal for societies and recognizes equity, equality, both in distribution of resources and in opportunities as central to a new development paradigm. And that paradigm is needed not just for countries that we label as developing, but for all of us in all regions of the world. So perhaps we need to be thinking about progressive taxation more, aggressive pursuit of tax evasion, greater economic democracy, minimum living wages for all. It's no good having equal pay for women and men if that pay doesn't allow you to function properly in your society and meet all of your needs. So I would like to propose to you that the silver bullet might be partnerships. And social inclusion is very, very important, but it is the deep vertical social inequalities themselves we need to address if we're going to be able to move towards the goals that were set in Cairo 20 years ago. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you very much, Professor Pickett and Madame Kadieva, for bringing into these deliberations a really broad set of cross-sectoral data and research evidence that challenge us to understand better the multiple and sometimes overlapping dimensions of inequity, and to innovate and to accelerate efforts to tackle inequalities at their root. A number of representatives from national governments and members of parliament have asked to make interventions, and we'll start right away with the first one representing the government of Armenia.
Thank you, Ms. Chair, distinguished delegates. Thank you very much, first of all, this very much inspiring presentations. The ICHD review process is particularly important for Armenia, a developing country facing almost each and every known challenge on population and development, ranging from aging, gender disparities, high levels of out-migration, unmet need for family planning, below replacement fertility, and many others in our fragile region with unresolved conflicts beyond blocked borders and threats to security and peace. Armenia recognizes very well that addressing these population challenges is critical for the development of our society and each individual. With this understanding and in line with our commitments towards implementation of ICPD, Armenia established coherent midterm policy frameworks. We have adopted a gender policy strategic program for 2011-2015 and a strategic action plan to combat gender-based violence for the same period, for 2011-2015. Armenia also established regional commissions in all provinces to solicitate action plans on gender equality and combating GBV. Armenia adopted the bill on ensuring equal rights and equal opportunities for women and men that particularly addresses the need for protecting under the law against gender-based discrimination. This gender equality bill is a new stage for formal gender policy in Armenia, aiming to reduce inequalities, increase gender awareness, and ensure the fundamental rights of women and men. A bill on combating gender-based violence and yet another bill against discrimination are officially circulated these days. Once adopted, the bill against discrimination would provide additional guarantees for protection of life, work, safety, and health for women, ethnic and sexual minorities, people with disabilities, the poor, and all those people who find themselves vulnerable or discriminated. Today, there is no denying that significant progress has been made in the fight for gender equality and combating discrimination and violence in Armenia. Recently, we witnessed another evidence that policies backed by financial resources and consistency in implementation deliver results. 2 weeks ago, Armenia attained Tier 1 status under 2013 Trafficking in Persons report, meaning it is now considered among the world's most successful countries in confronting the international scourge of human trafficking. Tier 1 ranking indicates that Armenia acknowledged the existence of human trafficking, made significant efforts to address the problem, and complies with certain standards. For the 5th year in a row, the government of Armenia, working closely with civil society, media, and international development partners, continued its sustained efforts to combat trafficking in persons, both at the policy and implementation levels. In 2012, there was an increase in investigations and rigorous prosecution of trafficking criminal cases, with stiff punishment of perpetrators and no suspended sentences handed down. On our way of enabling choices for people, Armenia emphasizes the role of partnerships, multi-stakeholder policy dialogue, and development cooperation. In the area of gender equality and combating gender-based violence, the development assistance of UNFPA to Armenian government and civil society are particularly valuable. From national data collection to policy formulation, in advocacy and education, in strengthening our institutions and promoting awareness of Armenians on their rights and choices, UNFPA championed technical inputs and support. On our way, we are also rethinking the key factors and drivers of development. We particularly recognize that effective policy responses to population and development priorities are actually impossible if focusing merely on the challenges on the dark side. We are on the way to consider new opportunities that global developments offer. Armenia recently supported public-private initiatives fostering new drivers for quality education and new partnerships for circular mobility of labor. This is why we welcome the new paradigm shift paving way for better understanding population priorities for our days and for coming decades. Challenging the very concept of challenges and moving the borders beyond current perception of human capital will particularly enable smaller developing countries like Armenia to focus on what can be achieved and what is worth to achieve with our drops of resources in the sea of troubles. Thank you.
I thank you very much for your statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of the government of Sweden.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Imagine a world where all individuals, regardless of sex, age, ethnicity, religion, marital status, disability status, sexual orientation, gender identity, HIV, or any other status, are free and have the right to seek their identity and fulfill their potential without fear of coercion, exclusion, or discrimination. This, as we unfortunately know, is not the reality for most people, a fact that is highlighted in the UNECE regional report on ICPD implementation. Some population groups are subject to inequalities and social exclusion more than others. Women and girls, young people, ethnic minorities, migrants, and lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender people are further often subject to multiple forms of discrimination. Madam Chair, the ICPD agenda emphasizes the pivotal importance of gender equality and the empowerment of women and girls. Improvements in women's and girls' political, social, economic, and health status, including sexual and reproductive health and rights, is recognized as an essential end in itself, as well as a prerequisite for achieving sustainable development. The report indicates that most countries in our region have made commendable achievements in bridging gaps between men and women in these critical areas. However, no country can claim to have reached absolute gender equality. Despite overwhelming evidence that gender inequality severely constrains women's autonomy and freedom, control over their own bodies, and restricts their opportunities in education, work, and public participation, gender equality is not as high on the agenda as it should be. On the individual's level, women's and girls' ability to enjoy their individual social, economic, and political and reproductive rights are influenced by harmful attitudes and stereotypes related to gender, which are still prevalent in our region. On a country level, we must recognize that gender inequality continues to hamper development, and I would like to underline the central roles that men and boys have when it comes to changing these values. We need to work with both men and women to realize long-term changes, because gender equality is a cornerstone to ensure development and prosperity of our countries. Madam Chair, elimination and prevention of gender-based violence is one particular area that is in need of increased efforts in our region as well as elsewhere. Violence against women and girls, including sexual violence and abuse, is a severe violation of human rights, as well as a serious impediment to women's social inclusion and a country's sustainable development. In combating gender-based violence against women, we must address the root causes of gender inequality, including changing norms, attitudes, and behaviors. We must also recognize the impacts on and the interlinkages with sexual and reproductive health and rights. The UNECE reports demonstrates that the last 2 decades have brought about important improvements in family lifestyle and individual well-being. The report further indicates that new family forms can be legally vulnerable with respect to their status and rights. Laws, policies, and strategies that address families must be reviewed so that they do not discriminate so-called non-traditional family formations, including single parents and same-sex couples. All individuals and couples must have equal access to services and rights, regardless of gender identity and sexual orientation. The needs and rights of population groups who are socially marginalized, discriminated against, and most at risk of social exclusion must be particularly addressed in our continued efforts for development. Fundamental human rights, specifically sexual and reproductive rights, must be respected, protected, and fulfilled. All individuals' ability to enjoy these rights free from discrimination, coercion, or violence must be guaranteed. Everyone, regardless of age, sex, ethnicity, religion, marital status, disability status, sexual orientation, gender identity, HIV, or any other status, must have these protections. Everyone must have the same rights and opportunities and be meaningfully involved in the decision-making processes that affect their own lives. Thank you.
I thank you very much for your statement, and I now give the floor to the Member of Parliament from Poland.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Good afternoon. I'm here as both Deputy Speaker of the Parliament of Poland, as well as in representation of the high-level task force for the ICPD. The task force was established to advance women's empowerment, gender equality, and the rights and empowerment of young people and sexual and reproductive rights for all, especially for those living in poverty and otherwise marginalized. Co-chaired by former President Tarja Halonen, who spoke yesterday as a keynote speaker, and Joaquin Chissano of Mozambique, our mission is to set a forward-looking agenda for the ICPD beyond 2014. Despite the relatively high standards of living in this region, great disparities exist both across and within countries. As the report for the conference notes, especially when it comes to poverty and exclusion, women are in almost all cases worse off than men due to gender discrimination in private and public life. This includes gender-based violence, gender pay gaps. Women remain underrepresented in leadership positions, in politics, and in business. As we all know, high youth unemployment is threatening the life prospects of millions, and especially marginalized groups face inequalities, discrimination, and limited protection of their human rights, including the Roma and other ethnic minorities, migrant women, people living with HIV and disabilities, and those belonging to sexual minorities. A measure of social inclusion and equality is the degree to which individuals are able to enjoy their human rights, including their sexual and reproductive rights. Sexual and reproductive health and rights are fundamental human rights, core elements of women's empowerment and gender equality to their full participation in social, economic, and political life, and central to furthering equality and equity, poverty eradication, and sustainable development across its social, economic, and environmental dimensions. Restrictions on freedom and choice and sexual reproductive health problems, as we all know, have grave consequences at many levels. Our region overall has considerably advanced the ICPD vision in some countries, but critical gaps and barriers remain. To address them, we at the high-level task force have identified 4 key areas with concrete actions that are needed to expand human rights and freedoms, equality and equity, and improve health and well-being. They focus on: first, legal and policy reforms to protect sexual and reproductive rights for all, regardless of sex, age, ethnicity, migrant, HIV and disability status, and sexual orientation, gender identity or expression, or any other factor. To achieve this, we need to launch public education campaign to enable the enjoyment of these rights without fear, discrimination, stigma, or violence. Remove barriers to access sexual and reproductive health services, including the age limitations or parental consent requirements for adolescents. Expand access to safe legal abortion and eliminate unsafe abortion and resulting maternal mortality and injuries to women and adolescent girls. While abortion is legal in most ECE countries, in some places is neither accessible nor safe. The need for abortion will not go away, and while wealthier women will find a way to access safe services, those without the financial means will be left little recourse but to resort to life-threatening underground practices. This again is a serious social injustice. and the criminalization of HIV and discrimination and violence against people living with HIV and AIDS. 9 countries in our region still criminalize HIV. Enforce laws banning harmful practices against girls, including early and forced marriage. In Eastern Europe and Central Asia, 11% of girls are child brides. Second, accelerate universal access to quality, comprehensive, and integrated sexual and reproductive health information, education, and services. 3, universal access to comprehensive sexuality education for all young people in and out of school. Young people need comprehensive approaches that equip them with the skills and knowledge to make informed decisions about their health, safety, relationships, and sexuality, while instilling principles of human rights, gender equality, respect, tolerance, and nonviolence, including to positively engaged boys and young men in ending gender-based violence. Finally, but not by no means least, the task force calls for the elimination of violence against women and girls and universal access to critical services for the victims of gender-based violence. This includes ensuring that responses to gender-based violence are systematically integrated into sexual and reproductive health services, a critical gap in ICPD implementation in many cases. And such services must include post-rape care, including emergency contraception and access to safe abortion services in all cases of rape and incest. These are just a few highlights of our recommendations. We believe that these are key elements of a forward-looking ICPD agenda that is truly right-based and inclusive. And we also are calling for them to be ensured in the new global post-2015 development agenda. Women's empowerment and gender equality, the rights and participation of adolescents and youth, and sexual and reproductive health and rights for all must be reflected as pillars and cross-cutting aspects of the new framework of the sustainable development goals. I thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you. With our apologies for the delay in handing you the floor, I'm now requesting the representative member of Parliament of Austria to please make her intervention.
Thank you very much. And also thank you, Poland, for this wonderful progressive profession. We are looking forward for implementing it. When we are...
You need to press the...
So once more, thank you very much, Poland, for this wonderful progressive confession. We are looking forward for the implementation. When we are talking about inequalities, social inclusion and rights, we must not ignore some of those people who are most at risk that they are treated unequally, or that they are socially excluded, or that their rights are withheld. People living with HIV and AIDS. Medicine and scientific research was quite successful the last years, even if we cannot heal the disease. But when it comes to the so-called social AIDS, progress is very poor. Very often people living with HIV and AIDS are members of marginalized groups. They seem to be outlaws, people you better do not get in touch with, because they are, for instance, prisoners or detainees, men who are having sex with men, injecting drug users, sex workers, transgender person, or migrants or refugees. And not to forget about the many ordinary people like married women or elderly people or children and teenagers living with HIV/AIDS. We all know that only if we do not exclude these people most at risk, and only if we do not drive them underground by criminalizing them, only if we guarantee all these people all their human rights and provide them access to modern medical treatment and care, as well as to voluntary testing, they can get the medicine, the drugs, they can get the information and the skills to protect themselves, their families, and their loved ones. Modern antiretroviral drugs help to decrease the viral load to a level where it is nearly impossible to infect others. And antiretroviral medicine is as good as the use of condoms, as good as safer sex, and treatment through prevention became reality. Only if we do not exclude and stigmatize people living with HIV and AIDS, but protect them and their human rights, we will be able to stop the pandemic. Even if medical treatment become less expensive because of the use of generics, we know that money is still an obstacle for poor people, an obstacle for poor health systems, and an obstacle for poor countries. And delightfully, everywhere in the world, the number of infections is declining, but it is not so in Eastern Europe and Central Asia. We observe there a dramatic increase in new infections. And even in the light of that, it is especially alarming that, for instance, the Global Fund stopped or decreased their fundings for programs in countries like Romania and Serbia, where now, because of lack of money, of funding, many NGOs had to cancel their services, which means that there are no more needle exchange programs, methadone programs available anymore. In consequences, it's up now to the governments and to the public health systems to fill this gap and to provide these services. And of course, I know this is a big financial burden for many of these countries. But I'm sure, and I want to conclude with that, even if we are aware that it's a burden and that it is not easy for poorer countries to afford, it must not be an excuse to ignore a general human rights-based approach to HIV/AIDS policy and STI policy in general everywhere in the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your succinct statement. And I now give the floor to a representative of the Ministry of Labor and Social Protection of Azerbaijan.
Госпожа председатель, уважаемые дамы и господа, позвольте прежде всего от имени азербайджанской делегации выразить признательность организаторам за проведение на столь высоком уровне актуальной на сегодняшний день конференции и предоставленную возможность участия в ней. Успехи, достигнутые Азербайджанской республикой за последние годы, вошли в историю нашей страны как важный этап укрепления государственности и социально-экономического развития. При этом обеспечиваются права всех граждан республики на равенство, свободу, достойный труд и социальную защиту, гарантированные как Конституцией страны, так и соответствующими нормативно-правовыми актами. Согласно расчетам Всемирного Давосского экономического форума, по конкурентоспособности азербайджанская экономика находится на 46-м месте в мире и на первом на пространстве СНГ. В отчетах Всемирного банка Doing Business Азербайджан также имеет высокий рейтинг по показателям ведения бизнеса, и в 2008 году Азербайджан был признан мировым лидером по проводимым реформам улучшения бизнес-среды. Мнение экспертов международных организаций сходится на том, что благодаря сбалансированной социально-экономической политике, успешно проводимой на протяжении последних лет, Азербайджанская республика находится в числе стран, наименее подверженных глобальному экономическому кризису. Страна сохраняет положительный темп роста ВВП, составивший в прошлом году 2,2%, а в ненефтяном секторе этот показатель достиг 9,7%, что говорит о диверсификации экономики страны и развитии ненефтяного сектора. Инфляция находится на уровне 1,1%. Принятые в области совершенствования социальной политики ряд указов президента страны и соответствующие государственные программы свидетельствуют о проводимых мерах, в результате которых существенно повысилось благосостояние населения страны. По данным на 2012 год, уровень бедности в стране за последние 10 лет снизился с 46% до 6%, а уровень безработицы с 9,2% до 5,2%. В результате проведения эффективной экономической политики в стране за 10 лет было создано более 1 200 000 новых рабочих мест. Проведение социальной политики в стране осуществляется в различных направлениях. в области гендерного равенства, в строительстве объектов здравоохранения и образования, развитии социальной инфраструктуры, обеспечении эффективной занятости за счет улучшения качества рабочей силы, повышения социальных выплат, зарплат и пенсий, реализации адресной социальной программы, а самое главное – усиление социальной защиты наиболее уязвимых слоев общества – малоимущих граждан, инвалидов, беженцев и вынужденных переселенцев, молодежи и других лиц, сталкивающихся с трудностями при конкуренции на рынке труда, интеграции их в общество. В целом этот список можно продолжить. Азербайджан относится к числу тех редких стран мира, которые даже в кризисные годы не только не сократили социальные программы, а напротив увеличили их. Причем инвестиционные и социальные программы реализуются за счет собственных финансовых возможностей страны. При этом осуществляется ряд социальных проектов даже за пределами страны. В то же время политические и социально-экономические реформы в стране проходят на фоне продолжающейся оккупации со стороны соседнего государства более 20% территории Азербайджана, когда более 4000 промышленных и сельскохозяйственных предприятий и более 300 тысяч рабочих мест остались на оккупированных территориях. Более 1 миллиона беженцев и вынужденных переселенцев оказали влияние на экономическое и социальное положение в республике, в особенности на рынок труда и в целом на демографическую ситуацию страны. Сегодня социальная защита именно этой категории населения, а также инвалидов войны, забота о них является приоритетным направлением социальной политики государства. В целом, за период 2001 по 2012 годы из Государственного нефтяного фонда и других финансовых источников были построены 77 современных поселка для беженцев и вынужденных переселенцев для их временного проживания. В целом, обеспечено бесплатным жильем более 140 тысяч беженцев и вынужденных переселенцев. Кроме того, в этих поселках построено 134 школы, 5 музыкальных школ, 48 детских садов, 51 объект здравоохранения, 43 объекта культуры, 2 олимпийских спортивных комплекса, многочисленные инфраструктурные объекты. Ведутся активные мероприятия по развитию занятости этой категории населения, причем бедность среди них за 10 лет сократилась с 75% до 15%. Таким образом, сегодня с уверенностью можно сказать, что в целом политика азербайджанского государства основывается на том, что в ее центре прежде всего человеческий фактор. В то же время реформы в стране не состоялись бы, если бы не была бы достаточной общественная поддержка не только самой ее общей идеи, но и конкретных мер, необходимых для ее претворения в жизнь. Упомянутые факторы, политическое согласие и эффективная система государственного управления оказывают определяющее воздействие на социальную политику и на развитие азербайджанского общества в целом. Благодарю за внимание.
Thank you. Thank you for your statement. Let me remind all subsequent speakers to take a look at this sign here so you can